The room was quiet, filled with an air of stillness that seemed almost permanent. Aiden's home was small, with just a worn-out couch, a coffee table with chipped edges, and a few old family photos hanging slightly crooked on the walls. The paint was faded, and the wallpaper in some corners was peeling, exposing patches of the wall beneath. There was a single lamp on the table, casting a warm but dim glow over the room as dusk began to settle outside. Aiden, a 7-year-old boy with an innocent face marked by traces of dirt, sat on the couch, clutching a little notebook filled with his own handwritten songs. His clothes were slightly oversized and worn, and his shoes had scuffs from too many long walks. Despite the modest surroundings, his eyes showed a quiet resilience, a glimpse of a tender, untold story waiting to unfold. If this tone and style works for you, let's move on to the next scene when you're ready. Aiden closed his eyes, and memories of his mother washed over him like a gentle wave. He could almost hear her soft, warm voice singing lullabies as she held him close, her arms wrapping him in a comfort he hadn't felt in a long time. Her voice had been his first introduction to music, a gentle melody that soothed him on difficult nights and made him feel safe even in the smallest, coziest corners of their modest home. In his mind, he pictured her smiling down at him with kind, tired eyes. She had always worn her hair pulled back, and Aiden remembered the faint scent of lavender and flour. She'd loved to bake, filling the house with smells that still lingered in his memory. Every time she laughed, it was as if light filled the room, and Aiden would watch her with a heart full of admiration, not knowing how much he'd come to miss that sound. One of his clearest memories was of her singing a lullaby she'd written just for him, her voice soft and soothing as she gently rocked him back and forth. Even as a little boy, Aiden had felt her love wrapped around him, a warmth that had made him believe nothing bad could ever reach them. Now, each note from that song lingered in his heart, an echo of her love that he clung to, trying to keep her presence alive in any way he could. He opened his eyes, feeling a pang of loneliness that only grew stronger. That song was the one he'd carry forever, the melody he'd sing to the world in memory of the woman he'd loved most. The house felt incomplete without her, as though something essential had been taken away, leaving behind a silent, aching void. Aiden often felt the absence of his mother in the quietest moments, especially in the evening when the shadows grew longer and the house fell into a deep hush. She'd always been the heartbeat of their home, and without her, the rhythm of life seemed to falter, leaving behind an emptiness too big for a 7-year-old to understand. Sitting alone in the small living room, Aiden glanced around, noticing all the little things that once made him feel secure, but now only reminded him of what was missing. Her knitting needles lay untouched on the side table, a reminder of the evenings she would spend humming softly as she worked on a new scarf or sweater. The scent of lavender that used to linger in the air was faint now, like a distant memory he couldn't quite hold on to. His father had grown quieter since her passing too, carrying a sadness that he rarely spoke of. Aiden would sometimes catch his father staring at her old chair, his face lost in thought, eyes distant and shadowed with sorrow. They didn't talk about her much. Maybe it hurt too much to put words to the emptiness. But Aiden missed the laughter, the warmth, the songs that used to fill their days, and he felt so small in the vast silence that had settled over them. He tried to keep some of her routines alive, whispering the lullabies she used to sing or setting her favorite flowers in a glass on the table. But it wasn't the same. Without her, even the songs he hummed felt incomplete, as if they were missing a harmony only she could provide. The world felt duller, as if someone had dimmed the colors he once loved. In those moments, he wished he could just hear her voice again, if only for a second. That longing stayed with him, a quiet ache that pushed him to hold on to every note, every word of her lullabies. For Aiden, those songs were all he had left of her warmth, and he clung to them as tightly as he could. The afternoon sun cast a soft, golden glow through the dusty window, bathing the room in a gentle light. Aiden sat cross-legged on the floor, his small hands gripping his notebook. It was the same notebook he'd been writing in since he lost his mother, filled with lines of lyrics and sketches he'd drawn to remind himself of her. Outside, the world was quiet, but inside, a melody was building in his mind, one he wished he could share with her. Humming softly, Aiden began to sing one of the songs he'd written for his mother, his voice no louder than a whisper. The lyrics spoke of memories he cherished, of her laughter, and of her warm hugs that could make anything feel safe. His voice trembled as he sang, the words carrying a mixture of love and longing that only he could understand. He sang of the times they'd spent together, her hand gently guiding his as they played pretend, the world simple and full of magic. Now, as he whispered these words, he felt as if he were calling out to her, hoping she could hear him from wherever she was. In that moment, the empty room felt a little less lonely. The notes drifted into the quiet, lingering in the air like a gentle embrace. Singing was his way of keeping her close, and though his voice was soft, his heart was full of all the love he still carried for her. One day after school, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Aiden sat on a bench in the schoolyard, humming the tune he'd written for his mother. His voice was soft, almost like a private whisper to himself, but every note held a raw emotion that seemed to float on the cool evening breeze. He didn't realize that he was being listened to until a voice broke his concentration. "Aiden, was that you singing just now?" Came the curious voice of his friend, Mia, who had walked up behind him. She was one of the few friends he had, a kind and observant girl with a love for music herself. Aiden froze, surprised that someone had heard him. He felt a bit shy, but there was also a flicker of pride at having someone notice. Yeah? I was just singing something I made up," he mumbled, looking down, embarrassed. "That was beautiful," Mia said, her eyes wide with admiration. You wrote that yourself?" She sounded genuinely amazed, and Aiden's cheeks turned pink. "You should sing that for everyone. There's a talent show coming up, you know?" Aiden shook his head at the thought. The idea of singing in front of a crowd seemed overwhelming, but Mia's encouragement gave him a little spark of confidence. She kept insisting, her voice filled with excitement and belief in him that he'd never really felt from anyone but his mother. "I don't know," he replied hesitantly. "I wrote it for my mom. I'm not sure I could." But Mia's enthusiasm was unwavering. "You should share it, Aiden. I think people would love to hear it. You have a gift." Her words lingered with him, a gentle nudge towards something he hadn't considered before. Maybe, just maybe, he could honor his mother's memory by sharing his song with others. The next morning, Aiden stood nervously outside the school's main office, clutching a sign-up form for the upcoming talent show. His heart raced as he read over the form again, wondering if he could really go through with it. The idea of performing his song, a song he'd written for his mother, was both thrilling and terrifying. But Mia's encouragement had planted a small, stubborn hope in him. Maybe singing it in front of others could bring her memory to life, if only for a little while. Taking a deep breath, Aiden walked up to the office window and slid the form to the secretary. "I'd like to sign up for the talent show," he whispered, barely meeting her eyes. The secretary gave him a warm smile as she took the form, and for a moment his nerves settled. It was official now. There was no turning back. That evening, Aiden went home and began practicing with renewed purpose. He locked himself in his room, singing his song in front of the small mirror on his wall. At first, his voice wavered and his gaze kept dropping to the floor. But with each repetition, he felt a little more of his mother's presence beside him, as if her memory was guiding him. He scribbled extra notes in his notebook, adjusting lines here and there, rewriting verses that felt too raw or vulnerable. This song was his way of speaking to her, of saying all the things he hadn't gotten to say. It had to be perfect. His eyes filled with tears as he practiced, but he pressed on, determined to do her memory justice. Over the next few days, Aiden practiced every chance he got. His father, noticing his focus and hearing faint strains of the song from Aiden's room, quietly watched from the doorway once, unseen. Though he didn't fully understand why Aiden was so devoted to the song, he respected his son's dedication. He could see a spark in Aiden's eyes, a resolve that reminded him of her. Finally, Aiden felt ready. He knew he'd still be scared on that stage, but he also knew he wasn't alone. His mother's memory was with him, carried in every note, and that thought gave him the strength he needed to keep going. The day of the auditions arrived, and Aiden stood outside the community center. his heart pounding against his chest. The place was buzzing with excitement as kids of all ages lined up, each one nervously clutching an instrument, practicing their dance moves, or rehearsing their lines. Aiden clutched his notebook, feeling small among the more confident performers, some dressed in bright costumes, and others accompanied by proud parents who cheered them on. Stepping inside, he felt the nerves kick in even harder. The large room was filled with kids waiting their turn, and the echo of laughter and voices bouncing off the walls seemed to add weight to his anxiety. He scanned the crowd, feeling out of place in his worn, simple clothes, and wondered if he should just leave. But then he remembered his mother's gentle smile and the warmth of her songs. He had come this far for her. He couldn't turn back now. As his name was called, Aiden took a deep, shaky breath and stepped onto the small stage. The audition room fell silent, and he could feel every eye on him. His palms were sweaty, and his voice wavered as he introduced himself, explaining that the song he was about to sing was written for his mother. Closing his eyes, Aiden took one more breath and began to sing. His voice, soft and trembling at first, grew steadier as he poured his heart into each line. The judges listened quietly, their expressions softening as his story unfolded through the song. By the time he finished, the entire room was still, and Aiden felt a new sense of confidence. His mother's memory had given him the courage to face this moment. After making it through the auditions, Aiden dedicated himself to practicing every day. As soon as he got home from school, he would finish his homework quickly and retreat to his room, shutting the door softly behind him. His small bedroom became his rehearsal space, where he'd stand in front of the mirror, gripping his makeshift microphone, an old hairbrush, and singing the song he'd written for his mother. At first, his voice would falter, the notes catching in his throat as memories of her would flood his mind. But he forced himself to keep going, pouring all his emotions into each line, hoping his voice would reach her somehow. He practiced until he could sing each verse clearly, his voice steady but filled with the tender love and quiet sorrow that only he could truly understand. Each day, he made little adjustments to the song, scribbling down new lines or erasing ones that didn't feel quite right. He wanted every word to be perfect, to capture the warmth of her smile, the sound of her laughter, and the love she'd always shown him. He practiced late into the evening, often until his throat felt hoarse, but he didn't mind. It was as if singing her song was the only thing that made the emptiness in the house feel a little less heavy. Aiden's father would sometimes pass by his room and pausing at the door to listen. At first, he didn't say anything, feeling the weight of his own grief in Aiden's quiet, determined voice. But eventually, one evening, he gently knocked on the door and stepped inside. "Can I listen?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Aiden nodded, surprised but relieved to have his father's presence with him. As he sang, his father sat quietly on the edge of the bed, listening to each word with a distant, pained expression. When Aiden finished, his father reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Aiden nodded, feeling a new kind of strength building inside him. With his father's support and his mother's memory guiding him, he felt more ready than ever to step onto the stage and share his song with the world. As the talent show approached, Aiden's father found himself torn between pride and worry. Watching his son practice every day, pouring his heart into a song written for his late mother, stirred feelings he'd long kept buried. He saw Aiden's determination, the way he clung to every note as if it were a lifeline, and he understood that singing this song was Aiden's way of keeping her memory alive. But he also feared that opening up this deeply might leave his son vulnerable. One evening, as Aiden was rehearsing in his room, his father sat alone at the kitchen table, staring down at a photograph of his late wife. In the picture, she was laughing, her arm around a younger Aiden. Her face was full of warmth, her joy nearly tangible even through the faded colors of the photo. He could see so much of her in Aiden, her resilience, her passion, her quiet strength. Yet the thought of Aiden standing on a stage, bearing his heart in front of a crowd, made his stomach tighten with anxiety. Finally, unable to ignore his concerns any longer, he knocked on Aiden's door and stepped inside. "Aiden," he began, his voice hesitant, "are you sure you want to do this? You don't have to go through with it if it's too much. Aiden looked up, his eyes steady and full of quiet determination. I want to, Dad. It's for her. It's the only way I can feel like she's still with me. His voice was soft but resolute, and his father felt a pang of both admiration and sorrow. Seeing his son's conviction, he sighed, finally letting go of his reluctance. All right, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I just don't want you to get hurt. But if this is what you need, I'll be there. I'll support you. Aiden smiled, the weight of his father's approval lifting his spirits. They sat together in the quiet, both thinking of her, and for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel quite as heavy. In that moment, his father realized that supporting Aiden's journey was also a way for him to reconnect with her memory, and he vowed to stand by his son as he honored her in the way only he could. The night of the talent show finals had arrived, and Aiden could hardly keep his hands from shaking as he stood backstage. The bustling sounds of the crowd drifted in from the auditorium, their excited murmurs and occasional laughter only making his nerves more intense. Peeking through the side curtains, he saw rows of filled seats, the stage lights casting a warm glow over the room. It felt huge, far bigger than he'd imagined, and the weight of the moment settled heavily on his small shoulders. Dressed in his best outfit, a simple, clean shirt and neatly pressed pants, he fidgeted with his collar, glancing around at the other performers. Some were older kids, adjusting their costumes, tuning their instruments, or stretching nervously. They all seemed so confident, while Aiden felt like he might melt from the pressure. His heart pounded as he clutched his microphone, rehearsing the lines in his head one more time, afraid he might forget them once he stepped on stage. Just then, his father came up behind him, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You've got this, Aiden," he whispered, his voice warm and steady. "Just sing from your heart. She'll be listening." Aiden looked up, meeting his father's gaze. The fear in his eyes softened just a bit, replaced by a spark of determination. He took a deep breath, allowing his father's words to sink in. This was more than just a performance. It was a tribute, a way to keep his mother's memory alive, even if only for a few minutes. The stage manager called his name, and Aiden took one last look at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod. Gathering his courage, he stepped forward, ready to face the spotlight and the crowd, carrying his mother's memory in every note he was about to sing. As Aiden walked out onto the stage, the bright lights hit him all at once, momentarily blinding him. He paused, blinking against the intensity, his small figure dwarfed by the vast open space around him. The crowd hushed, and in that stillness, Aiden could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his chest. It felt as if every single person in the room was waiting, holding their breath, watching his every move. He gripped the microphone tightly, his hands clammy, and took a shaky breath. His eyes scanned the rows of faces in the audience, the sea of strangers blurred by the stage lights. Then he found his father, sitting near the front, watching him with a look of quiet pride and reassurance. Just seeing him there gave Aiden a small, yet comforting sense of strength. His father nodded gently, as if to say, "I'm here, you're not alone." Aiden's gaze softened, and he felt a bit of his fear start to fade. He remembered why he was here. This wasn't just a song. This was his message to his mother, his way of sharing the memories and love he carried for her. He closed his eyes for a moment, calling up her face in his mind, the warmth of her smile, the gentleness in her voice. Her presence felt close, as if she were standing right beside him. As the music started softly in the background, he brought the microphone to his lips, and with a deep breath, he began to sing. His voice was quiet at first, wavering slightly, but as the words flowed out, he felt something powerful rising within him. Each note was filled with a raw, unfiltered love, an aching vulnerability that held the attention of every person in the room. The audience sat in silence, captivated by the small boy with the big, heartfelt voice. His voice grew steadier, stronger, as he sang the lines he'd written for her, the lullabies she'd sung, the warmth she'd brought into his life, the emptiness he'd felt since she'd been gone. There was no hiding the tears in his eyes, but he didn't let them stop him. He sang with everything he had, allowing his heart to spill over into each line. When he finished the first verse, there was a stillness that filled the room, as if the entire audience was breathing as one, captivated by his courage and the love he was sharing. Aiden continued, his voice carrying his mother's memory, honoring her in a way that reached every soul present. The room fell into an expectant hush as Aiden stood center stage, the weight of the microphone in his small hand grounding him as he prepared to share his song. He closed his eyes, summoning the memories he held dear, the warmth of his mother's arms, the way she'd smiled just before she started singing a lullaby. The familiar melody rose in his mind, and with a deep breath, he began to sing. His voice was soft at first, barely a whisper, but the purity of his tone reached out, filling the silence with a tenderness that took everyone by surprise. The words he had written for his mother flowed from him, each one carefully chosen to capture the love and loss he felt. His voice quivered slightly, carrying the raw vulnerability of a child missing someone they loved with all their heart. "This is for you, Mom," he had whispered to himself just before stepping on stage. And now, as he sang the opening lines, it was as though he were speaking directly to her, his words a bridge between his world and wherever she was. His voice found strength as he sang about the memories of her lullabies, about how she'd hold him close and make everything feel safe. He sang of her warmth, her laughter, and how each day without her felt colder, a shadow of the light she had brought into his life. The lyrics unfolded like a story, each verse painted with moments they'd shared, both big and small. He sang about the sound of her voice as she called his name, about the comfort of her hand in his, and the way she'd reassure him when he felt afraid. Aiden's voice trembled as he sang these memories, but he didn't falter. He let the emotions surge, carrying him through the song, his voice swelling with love and grief. The audience sat transfixed, leaning forward as though afraid to miss a single note. Some wiped tears from their eyes, moved by the sheer honesty and depth of feeling in Aiden's performance. Even the judges, who had seen countless acts before, were visibly affected, their faces softened as they listened. Aiden wasn't just singing, he was sharing his heart, his loss, and his unwavering love. Then, he reached the bridge of the song, a part he'd written with more intensity, describing the pain of waking up each day knowing she was no longer there, and the quiet emptiness that had taken her place. His voice rose, filled with an aching power as he sang, "I look for you in every corner of my life, but you're just a whisper, a memory I can't hold." He poured his sorrow into each note, giving life to his grief and his longing, the words echoing through the room like a prayer. His eyes brimmed with tears, and he didn't try to hide them. He let them fall, each tear a testament to the love he still held for his mother. And as he sang, it felt as if the crowd disappeared, the room fading away until it was just him and his mother's memory. In the final verse, his voice softened, becoming almost a whisper again. He sang about hope, the hope that she was watching over him, that somewhere, somehow, she could hear him, and that she'd know he hadn't forgotten her. He ended the song with a quiet, almost broken, "I miss you every day, Mom. This is for you." When the last note faded, the silence in the room was absolute. Aiden stood there, his heart still racing, tears still fresh on his cheeks. For a moment, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he'd never felt before. But as he looked out at the audience, he saw the impact his song had made. People were wiping their eyes, their expressions filled with empathy and admiration. His father, sitting near the front, was among them, his face a mixture of pride and sorrow, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. He had known that Aiden's song would be powerful, but he hadn't expected it to reach so deeply into his own heart. Seeing his son on that stage, singing a song filled with memories they both held, made him feel closer to Aiden and to his late wife than he had in a long time. The applause started quietly, a single clap, then another, until the entire room erupted in cheers and applause that seemed to shake the walls. Aiden took a shaky breath, looking out at the crowd in awe. He had done it. He had sung his heart out, given everything he had for the memory of his mother. And as the applause washed over him, he felt a warmth settle in his chest, a sense of peace and connection that he hadn't felt since she'd been gone. In that moment, he knew she was there, that somehow she'd heard his song. And he knew that no matter how many years passed, his love for her would always be there, carried in every note he sang. As the final note of Aiden's song lingered in the air, the auditorium remained silent, as if no one dared to break the spell his voice had cast. Slowly, the audience began to process what they just witnessed, a heartfelt, deeply vulnerable performance from a young boy who had laid his heart bare before them. The depth of his love, his grief, and his bravery left a powerful impression on every soul in the room. In the first few rows, some audience members were visibly wiping away tears, touched by the raw sincerity of Aiden's song. Parents clutched their children's hands a little tighter, reminded of their own love for their families. Those who had also experienced loss felt a deep resonance with Aiden's words, as if he had sung not only for himself, but for anyone who had ever loved and lost someone dear. A few people exchanged glances, astonished by the intensity of emotions that someone so young could convey. It wasn't just Aiden's song, it was the way he had poured his entire heart into it, his voice quivering yet determined, carrying the weight of his memories and longing. Some in the audience shook their heads in quiet admiration, while others pressed hands to their chests, overcome by the mixture of sadness and beauty. Even the judges, who had witnessed countless performances over the years, were moved, their expressions softened with respect and awe. They seemed momentarily lost for words, taken aback by the raw talent and emotional depth Aiden had shown. When the applause finally erupted, it was thunderous, building in waves as everyone stood to their feet, honoring the courage and spirit of the young boy who had reminded them all of the power of love, even through the deepest pain. As Aiden held the final note of his song, his father sat motionless in the audience, staring at his son on stage. The song had stirred emotions he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. The raw, heartfelt lyrics brought back memories of his wife's laughter, her warmth, and the joy she had brought into their lives. He could see pieces of her in Aiden, her kindness, her quiet strength, and now her love for music, expressed in a way so pure and moving that it left him speechless. A tear slipped down his cheek, one he hadn't expected. He had told himself he needed to be strong for Aiden, to keep moving forward, but watching his son pour out his heart so bravely on stage broke down the walls he'd built around his own grief. He hadn't realized how deeply Aiden's loss had mirrored his own, or how much pain his son had carried silently, channeling it into this song. For a long moment, he simply sat there, overwhelmed. The applause roared around him, but all he could see was Aiden, standing alone on stage, his face still filled with the echoes of the emotions he had just released. His heart swelled with pride and an intense admiration for his son, who had found a way to honor his mother's memory through music. As the audience rose to give Aiden a standing ovation, he found himself standing too, clapping along with everyone else. But his applause felt different, deeper, almost reverent, as he realized how much courage it must have taken for Aiden to share something so personal. He wished his wife could be there to see this, to witness the beautiful, strong boy they had raised together. When Aiden's eyes found his father's in the crowd, he could see his dad's pride, his love, and the glisten of tears he wasn't hiding. Aiden's father mouthed the words, "I'm so proud of you," and gave him a small, reassuring nod. In that moment, they didn't need to speak. They both understood the pain, the love, and the sense of healing that had come from sharing this song. As the applause continued, his father felt something shift within him. He wasn't alone in his grief, just as Aiden wasn't. They shared this loss, but now they also shared the memory, the love, and the strength to carry on together. Aiden stood on stage, overwhelmed by the response. He felt as though he were in a dream, one where his voice had reached beyond the stage, beyond the room, and somehow even beyond the years since his mother had passed. His heart still raced, his emotions raw and exposed, but seeing the audience rise to their feet, clapping with tear-streaked faces and warm smiles, filled him with a sense of peace. He glanced to the front row, where his father stood, applauding with pride shining in his eyes. There was a look on his face that Aiden hadn't seen in a long time, a soft, open expression that seemed to say, "I understand." For a brief moment, it felt as if his mother were there too, watching from somewhere, her presence filling the empty spaces in his heart. The MC walked onto the stage, allowing the applause to quiet before approaching Aiden with a gentle smile. "That was truly beautiful, Aiden," she said into the microphone. "You've touched everyone here tonight. Thank you for sharing your story and your song with us." Aiden smiled shyly, feeling a warmth spread across his cheeks. He hadn't expected this, any of it. He'd simply wanted to sing for his mother, to keep her memory alive. Yet somehow his song had reached all these people, reminding them of their own loved ones, their own cherished memories. As he turned to leave the stage, the applause continued, following him like a gentle wave of support. And in that moment, Aiden knew that he had done something extraordinary, not just for his mother, but for himself. He'd found a way to connect with her once more. And he knew, deep in his heart, that her memory would always be with him, carried in every note he sang. As Aiden stepped off the stage, his legs felt unsteady, and his mind buzzed with the whirlwind of emotions he had just poured out. The sound of applause still echoed faintly in his ears as he made his way backstage, where performers and stage crew congratulated him with warm smiles and encouraging nods. But Aiden only had one person on his mind, his father. Aiden spotted him near the hallway entrance, standing still amidst the movement of the crowd, his gaze fixed solely on his son. There was a quiet intensity in his father's eyes, a mixture of pride, sorrow, and deep admiration. As Aiden approached, his father took a few steps forward, meeting him halfway. Without a word, he reached down, pulling Aiden into a strong, protective hug. For a moment, they stood there in silence, Aiden's head pressed against his father's chest. He could feel the steady beat of his father's heart, and for the first time in a long while, he felt truly safe and understood. His father held him tightly, one hand gently resting on the back of his head as if he were a little boy again. "You were incredible, Aiden," his father murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Aiden looked up, seeing tears glistening in his father's eyes, a sight he had rarely seen. "Your mother? She would be so proud. I'm so proud of you." Hearing these words, Aiden felt a swell of relief and love wash over him. He had spent so long missing his mother, trying to keep her memory alive through his music, but in that moment, he realized he wasn't alone in his grief. His father had carried the same loss, the same heartache, yet somehow they had both found a way to honor her together. "She was there tonight, wasn't she, Dad?" Aiden whispered, his voice barely audible. He wanted reassurance, a confirmation that he had truly reached his mother somehow through the song he'd sung. His father nodded, giving Aiden's shoulder a gentle squeeze. "Yes, son, I believe she was, and I think she heard every word." Aiden smiled through the tears that had begun to gather in his eyes once more. In his father's embrace, he felt as though his family was whole again, even if just in spirit. The silence between them was filled with understanding, and for the first time, Aiden sensed that his father truly understood the weight of his love and the pain of his loss. As they left the venue together, his father kept a protective arm around Aiden's shoulders. They walked in the quiet of the evening, side by side, united by both the sadness and the love they shared. The performance had not only brought Aiden closer to his mother's memory, but had also rekindled the bond between father and son, a bond strengthened by the legacy of the woman they both missed deeply. A few days after the performance, Aiden felt a quiet urge to visit his mother's grave, as if something were calling him there. With his father by his side, they made their way to the peaceful hillside cemetery where she rested. The early morning was wrapped in a gentle mist, and the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a warm glow over the rows of stones. The world seemed quiet and still, a calm contrast to the bustling theater and flashing lights of the talent show. As they reached her grave, Aiden let go of his father's hand and knelt down beside the headstone. He traced the letters of her name, carved into the cool stone, feeling the weight of all the memories he had tried to capture in his song. For so long, he had worried that her presence was slipping away from him, that as he grew older, he might forget the little things. Her laugh, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the softness of her hands. But now, after singing for her in front of all those people, he felt closer to her than he had in years. It was as though each word, each note he had sung had brought her closer, connecting his heart to hers in a way that even time couldn't diminish. "Mom," he whispered softly, his voice barely louder than the breeze rustling the leaves around him. "I hope you heard me. I sang for you, just like I promised I would. He looked down at the flowers he'd brought, a small bundle of lavender, her favorite. Gently, he placed them at the base of the headstone, the purple buds vibrant against the muted gray. His fingers lingered on the petals, and he closed his eyes, remembering how the scent had once filled their home, how she'd hum and bustle about with the same fragrance clinging to her clothes. As he sat there, the memories washed over him, her lullabies, her comforting presence, the way she'd hold him when he was afraid. He felt the familiar ache in his chest, but this time it was softened by the joy of having shared her memory with others. The song had been his way of saying goodbye, but also of keeping her with him, forever intertwined in his music and his heart. His father stood nearby, watching silently, giving Aiden the space he needed. He understood that this moment was Aiden's, a time for him to be alone with the memory of his mother. But there was comfort in knowing that his father was there, sharing in the silent tribute. Finally, Aiden spoke again, his voice steady but full of emotion. I won't ever stop singing for you, Mom. I know you're with me now. I can feel it. A tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't brush it away. Instead, he let it fall, a small reminder of the love he still carried, a love that didn't need words or songs to exist. In that quiet moment, Aiden felt an incredible sense of peace. He knew he could face whatever came next, carrying her memory not as a burden, but as a gift. She had given him the strength to sing, to face the world with courage, and now that strength would live on in every note he sang, in every melody he created. After a while, his father walked over, gently placing a hand on Aiden's shoulder. Are you ready, son? He asked softly. Aiden nodded, feeling lighter somehow, as if the weight of his grief had transformed into something different. A gentle presence that would always be with him, guiding him forward. He stood, glancing one last time at his mother's name etched in stone, and then took his father's hand. As they walked down the path away from the grave, Aiden looked up at the sky, where the sun was breaking through the morning clouds. He felt her with him, not in the way he had once hoped to physically keep her close, but in a way that felt just as real, just as enduring. With a small, determined smile, he thought about the future. His song for her had been heard, and his voice had carried her memory into the world. She would always be part of him, woven into his music, his dreams, and his life. And for Aiden, that was enough.